Welcome back. I'm Joe.
Hey everyone, Sunny here. Today we're looking at, well, more than just one event. We're kind of using it as a lens, you know?
Right, a way to explore something much bigger.
Yeah, the sort of complex layers of a system, how information gets managed, maybe controlled, and the powerful stories governments try to tell the world. So we're diving deep into what one really tragic car crash might reveal about a country and its relationship with truth, and maybe even its own people.
Exactly, and we're starting with this specific, very sad incident. It happened back on March 29th, 2025.
Okay.
This was on an expressway over in Anhui in China, and the vehicle involved was, well, it was one that had generated a lot of buzz, a brand new Xiaomi SU7 electric car.
Right, the SU7. That was Xiaomi's big jump into the EV market, wasn't it?
It was a huge leap.
Now, the details of the accident itself, they're pretty stark, aren't they?
They are.
This car, from what we understand, it was using its navigate on autopilot function, NOA, they call it.
That's the one.
And it just crashed hard into a concrete barrier.
Violently, yeah. And the speed involved is really important here to understand just how bad it was.
How fast?
Reports say the car hit that barrier at roughly 97 kilometers per hour. That's, what, around 60 miles per hour?
60 miles per hour into a concrete barrier. Wow.
Yeah, but here's the really troubling detail that came out.
Okay.
The area where this happened, it was under construction. The posted speed limit was way lower, only 60 kilometers per hour.
Okay, so significantly slower.
Right. But just moments before hitting the wall, the vehicle apparently sped up. It reached 116 kilometers.
Accelerated into the crash zone.
That's what the report suggests. The consequences, like you said, just devastating.
Awful.
The car caught fire, which, you know, that's a concern with high-impact EV crashes anyway. But what made this even more tragic, the doors didn't automatically unlock after the crash. Inside, there were 3 young women, college students. They couldn't get out of the burning car. They died. It's heartbreaking.
Just terrible. Absolutely awful. And an event like that, it obviously sends ripples, right? People react.
Immediately. Xiaomi's CEO, Lei Jin, he reacted pretty quickly. Put out a statement on Weibo, expressed sorrow, promised they'd improve safety. You know, the kind of thing you'd expect.
Yeah. Standard corporate response, maybe?
Perhaps. But maybe more telling, and definitely faster than you might usually see, was the government's reaction.
Oh. What did they do?
Almost right away, regulators stepped in. New rule. Just like that.
A new rule about what?
They banned car companies from using terms like automatic driving in their ads.
Oh.
Instead, they have to use more precise language, like driving assist, making it crystal clear this tech is SAE Level 2.
Level 2 meaning it helps, but you're still driving.
Exactly. It assists, but the driver has to be supervising constantly, always responsible.
That reaction feels significant. Like maybe they were uncomfortable with how people were seeing this tech or how it was being sold. A move to control the narrative right away.
It really does feel that way. And controlling the narrative, that is a massive part of this whole story.
How so?
Well, just look at how the discussion about this crash played out on different platforms.
Yeah.
You take somewhere like Weibo, inside China.
Right.
Huge amount of talk initially. You'd expect that, right?
Yeah.
Tragic accident, high-profile new car.
Sure.
But the pattern that emerges, based on the information we've seen, is that critical stuff, especially anything that might make the government look bad, or state-linked industries, which these big EV companies definitely are, that kind of content was likely, well, censored, or maybe just deleted.
So a lot of noise at first, but then it gets kind of filtered, managed.
Precisely. You end up with a sort of curated version of what people are saying. Now, contrast that with what was happening outside China on platforms like X.
Always different there.
Yeah, much more open discussion. People could talk freely about, say, other similar accidents involving assisted driving systems. They could bring up tricky things like who's liable for insurance in these crashes. Share info without seeming to worry about getting in trouble.
Makes sense. But the catch with the X discussion is, well, most people inside China can't easily access it, right?
Exactly. That's the key. So you get this strange split reality. Inside China, you have this possibly sanitized, controlled conversation. Outside, it's much freer, more critical, but it doesn't really penetrate back inside easily.
And this whole dynamic, it connects to something deeper about the system itself, doesn't it? Something about pressure.
Yeah, the material we looked at talks about this pervasive sense of pressure. It suggests that car owners, maybe the public generally, can feel this pressure to sort of lower their posture and praise the system.
Lower their posture.
It's not just about avoiding a fight. It's described as something deeper, kind of ingrained in society because of the political climate.
Okay, let's unpack that. Because, in many places, if your fancy new car crashes and maybe the tech seemed faulty, you'd be angry, right?
Furious.
You'd want answers. You might sue the company. It's a consumer rights thing, a safety thing.
Absolutely. That's the normal expectation. But when you're dealing with these huge companies in China, think BYD, Huawei, or now Xiaomi with their EVs, they're not just private companies like we might think of them here.
How are they different?
They have really close ties to the state, very close. So criticizing their product, especially a flagship product, something that represents China's tech progress that can easily get twisted.
Twisted into what?
Into something like slandering national industry. Even worse, being disloyal to the country.
Wow. Just for complaining about your car.
The logic, and it might sound pretty strange to listeners outside that system, is that these companies, their success, it is China's progress, China's strength. So if you question the quality or the safety, it gets interpreted as questioning the nation itself. It turns a product complaint into a political loyalty test.
Okay, that's a huge leap. So a bug in your car's software isn't just a defect. It could be seen as you attacking China's national ambition.
Pretty much.
And the consequences for speaking out, for making that criticism, they can be real.
They can be quite serious, yeah. The information mentions the possibility of things like being invited for tea.
Which is code for?
Being called in for questioning by state security. It's a well-known euphemism. Or, in more serious cases, you could face administrative detention that's being held by police without formal charges or a court hearing.
Just for complaining online, potentially.
The potential for that kind of response is a very powerful reason for people to just stay quiet, even if they have a legitimate problem.
And that's where we see how this car crash, as awful as it is on its own, really acts like a kind of microcosm, doesn't it? A small example reflecting these much bigger systemic things going on in China. It kind of lifts the curtain on how things actually work there.
It really does. To get why a car complaint becomes political, you got to look at the underlying political system.
Yeah.
It's described as a one-party state. The Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, is the ultimate authority, no question. The party is often seen, and it acts like it's above the law, above the media, above the market, even above private life.
So there aren't really independent checks and balances, nothing that truly limits the party's power.
Not in the way we understand them elsewhere. Those clear lines we might take for granted between government and business, public and private, a consumer issue versus a political one, those lines get very blurry. Or maybe they just don't exist in the same way.
So basically anything could become political if the party decides it is.
Exactly. Your complaint about a car, suddenly it's undermining national pride, or disrupting social stability, or maybe you're being influenced by, hostile foreign forces.
And living under that constant potential for politicization, that must have a huge effect on people, right? The sources use some strong words, like people being trained or even domesticated.
Yes, that's the language used, a tamed populace.
Yeah.
And what that training looks like, in practice, is this deep, almost gut-level understanding of what you can say and what you absolutely cannot say.
You just learn the boundaries.
You learn them very well. People avoid speaking out, especially on anything sensitive, because the fear of what might happen is real.
What kind of fear, specifically?
Well, fear of being invited for tea, which is intimidating and disruptive to your life, or fear of what's called social death.
Social death. That sounds chilling.
It is. It means being ostracized. Losing your job, maybe your apartment, having doors closed to you, basically being shut out of normal society because you crossed the line.
Wow.
And this leads to widespread self-censorship. People don't even need to be told anymore. They just know instinctively what topics to avoid, what opinions not to voice. They build those invisible fences inside their own heads.
It sounds exhausting. Always having to watch what you say, what you type.
It must be. And the sources suggest this kind of environment can also shape how people relate to power itself. Some might actually start to, worship power.
Worship it.
By seeing the state's authority as the only real source of safety and stability. Believing that going along, conforming, is the only smart way to live. Resistance seems pointless, maybe dangerous, so you get this kind of passive acceptance even if things are unfair or risky.
This leads us to a really vivid phrase that was mentioned, a Chinese saying about this psychological dynamic.
Yes, it's quite blunt, quite striking.
Yeah.
Yo shimin.
Okay, what's the translation and what does it mean?
Literally, it's something like flip your eyes white when choked, but brag and boast when released.
Flip your eyes when choked, brag when released. Okay. Break that down for us in this context. How does that relate to, say, the car owner?
It describes this pattern of sudden, total surrender when direct pressure is applied. The choking is when the authorities step in, or when you face that real threat of consequences for speaking out. And you flip your eyes, meaning you just completely give in. You submit totally. We've seen this happen, right? People who maybe complained loudly at first, then suddenly they issue these public apologies, or they even start praising the company or the system they were just criticizing. They fold completely.
Okay, I see. So that's the first part. What about the second part, brag when released?
That's the other side of the coin. Once the immediate pressure is off, the hand is released from the neck, they might swing the other way. They overcompensate.
Ow.
Maybe by becoming super patriotic, bragging about China's achievements, praising the government loudly. It's like they avoid dealing with the reality of what just happened, the unfairness or the danger they faced. It's a coping mechanism, maybe? Dealing with the trauma, the cognitive dissonance?
And the sources suggest this comes from a lack of real security.
Yeah, a lack of fundamental legal protection or rights. Plus, this sort of dual personality the system encourages. Appear tough, but be ready to submit. And maybe a false confidence built on nationalism instead of actual freedom.
So it's not just about one person backing down. It's a deeper psychological pattern born from living under that constant pressure. And this doesn't just stay inside China, does it? This system, this control, it affects how China presents itself to the world.
Absolutely. This is where the idea Tiesha comes in, the great external propaganda.
Okay, what is that exactly?
It's the CCP's deliberate, large-scale, systematic strategy to shape international opinion, to manage communication globally and project a very specific, positive narrative about China.
And what's the goal of this huge propaganda effort?
Well, based on the information, the goals seem pretty clear. One, cover up domestic problems, things like safety issues, human rights abuses, economic troubles. Two, create this often quite false image of the China model, their political system, their economy as being superior, more efficient, more stable than, say, Western democracies. Three, try to weaken the appeal of democratic ideas globally. And four, ultimately, gain more influence in markets, in politics, in the global conversation.
So it's much bigger than just selling products. It's selling the system itself, selling this idea of China's rise as inevitable and good.
Exactly. And the strong China car narrative fits perfectly into this. It uses tech nationalism.
Tech nationalism.
Yeah, presenting EVs, 5G, AI, whatever.
Yeah.
Presenting it not just as technology, but as powerful symbols of China's rise, its innovation, its global power status.
Okay. And how do they build that narrative for people outside China?
A few ways. One is selective showcasing. They highlight the successes, look at BYD's sales numbers, look how fast they develop new models, while carefully downplaying or just ignoring the failures, the quality issues, the negative user experiences like that tragic crash. You get the glossy brochure version.
So lots of ads about speed and features, but maybe not so much on, say, independent crash test data or long-term battery life studies.
That's the general idea.
Yeah.
And the other key tactic, which ties right back to domestic control, is suppressing criticism.
How does that work externally?
By controlling their own media, limiting access for foreign journalists, punishing voices inside China who speak out. They create this controlled information bubble. So if you're outside and not digging too deep, you might get the impression that everything's great, everyone's happy. It helps make the idea that China cars are strong feel like, well, almost politically correct. If you question it, you risk being accused of being anti-China or biased or pushing a Western agenda.
Right, which makes it really hard for genuine concerns about safety or quality to even get heard through all that noise. So this big polished narrative, the ASHI, what's the reality behind it according to the information we looked at?
Well, the contrast is pretty stark. The propaganda paints a picture of amazing tech, super reliable products. But the reality described includes real worries about actual product quality.
Like what?
Questions about whether corners are cut, maybe using cheaper parts to keep prices down, which could lead to, higher failure rates, or batteries that don't last as long as the competition.
That's pretty fundamental for a buyer.
Absolutely. And getting solid info is tough because of issues with data transparency. There's a lack of reliable, independent data on problems, accidents, real-world performance. It's hard to get an objective view.
And what about the actual car owners, the users in China?
That brings up user rights. The material highlights how difficult it can be for consumers there to actually defend their rights if something goes wrong. Like we talked about, complaining can be risky. Getting compensation or even just speaking out without facing consequences, it's not straightforward. You can't just easily sue a giant state-linked company.
And the whole industry might not be as stable as it looks.
Yeah, there's mention of policy distortion. Some companies are seen as depending heavily on government subsidies, on state support, which raises the question, is their success purely market-driven, or is it kind of propped up? The example of Evergrande Auto collapsing is given as a cautionary tale of what happens when that support maybe disappears.
So you have these potentially serious issues. Quality concerns, lack of data, weak user rights, maybe shaky financials, and these are described as being actively concealed by the big propaganda machine.
Exactly. Which means, unfortunately, that investors or consumers outside China, if they only see that shiny surface, they could stepping on landmines, making big decisions based on an incomplete, maybe even misleading picture of the product and the system behind it.
This whole situation, it forces you to ask a pretty basic question, doesn't it? Especially when thinking about global trade or technology. Who can actually accept this kind of system?
It's a tough question, and the answer probably varies a lot depending on who you are, where you come from. The material suggests that inside China, many people might accept it.
Why?
Maybe they see it as a trade-off, giving up some freedoms for what they perceive as stability or economic progress. Maybe they genuinely believe in the national goals, the push for tech leadership. They might feel the benefits outweigh the downsides, or maybe they just don't see any other option.
But looking at it from outside China?
For many people, especially in democratic countries, the limits on basic rights are a deal breaker, particularly the lack of free speech around public safety. The idea that you couldn't freely discuss a terrible accident involving new technology without fearing the government, that just clashes fundamentally with the values of an open society.
The sources brought up a comparison that really drives this home, right? Comparing mainland China with a democratic place like Taiwan.
Yeah, that comparison is really telling. In Taiwan, you have the freedom to criticize the government, criticize companies, criticize products. There are legal protections for speech. People can and do sue the government. There's a strong sense of civic awareness. You're not going to disappear for posting a negative review video or be forced into some humiliating public apology.
And then you contrast that with the system in mainland China we've been discussing, which is described as basically the opposite on all those points.
Right. Severe speech restrictions. The law serves the party. Civic engagement is discouraged in favor of loyalty. And there's that constant underlying threat if you step out of line, even about something like a car.
So the comparison really makes you think about priorities. When we look at a product or a country's economic success, are we only seeing the price, the features, the efficiency?
Or are we also thinking about the invisible costs? The cost to freedom, to transparency, to basic rights that might be embedded in the system that made that product.
The information we reviewed really seems to emphasize the need for, critical thinking, media literacy, especially when faced with these big state-backed propaganda campaigns.
Yeah, and vigilance about protecting our own freedoms. You really appreciate free speech when you see what happens in places where it's heavily restricted. It's about understanding why democratic systems matter, even with all their flaws, because they allow for that critical discussion, for accountability, for speaking truth to power, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it? That whether or not you can criticize a product actually tells you a lot about the society it came from.
A whole lot. It's more than just a consumer issue. It's a reflection of the underlying political system.
So wrapping this up, that electric car crash back in March, it wasn't just a sad news story. It was really a glimpse into a system that fundamentally struggles with open discussion of its problems, especially when those problems might tarnish the national image or reveal deeper flaws.
And suppressing those honest voices, controlling the information flow, twisting criticism into disloyalty. That's not presented as an accident or a mistake. It's described as a core feature of how the system maintains control and manages its narrative.
And that whole strong China car story pushed so hard inside and outside the country. It seems it's less about the actual cars sometimes and more about selling the political system, the China model, to the rest of us.
The China dream that's being marketed globally, according to this analysis, it comes packaged with these fundamental restrictions on freedom and transparency that just don't align with open democratic values.
So maybe here's a final thought for you to consider. The next time you encounter some impressive new tech, maybe from a country with a very different system, are you only looking at the price tag and the shiny features?
Or are you also thinking about those potential hidden costs, the costs embedded in the system that created it? What does the ability, or maybe the inability, of an ordinary person there to openly complain about that product really tell you about the society it comes from? Something to chew on.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, we hope this conversation gave you some useful perspective on how technology, politics, and information all intersect in today's world. It's complex stuff.
Absolutely. If you found this valuable, please do subscribe. Maybe share it with someone else you think might find it interesting. And remember, you can always submit source material for us to tackle in a future deep dive. Until next time.
I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Micky to Life. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it.